To ancient people, numbers represented things they could see and touch. 1 stone, 5 sheep. Numbers described real, tangible things. But what about numbers that don't exist? What does -1 even mean? The concept of negative numbers was unthinkable to early civilizations. A length of -3 meters? That makes no sense. You're saying debt can be written as a number? Debt isn't a number, it's just a situation. And yet, over thousands of years, humans shaped mathematics to fit their needs. The discovery of negative numbers was a slow, reluctant process. And today, the number -1, something we take for granted, was once a radical, world-changing idea. To ancient scholars, numbers were meant to describe reality. Mathematics was a tool for measuring length, area, and volume, all things that existed. So what happens when a calculation gives you a negative number? How can a triangle have a side that is -5 centimeters long? Can a person's height be -6 feet? To philosophers like Aristotle, this was absurd. He believed nothingness couldn't exist, and that meant numbers like -1 couldn't exist either. Even Greek and Roman mathematicians saw negative numbers as nonsense. If a calculation led to a negative answer, they simply declared, "This equation has no solution." In their view, negative numbers weren't real, so they weren't even worth considering. But the real world didn't follow their rules. Imagine a merchant who borrows $5 from a friend. He now owes his friend that money. So what happens when we try to write this down in numbers? If he started with $10 but lent 5 to someone else, the math is simple. 10 minus 5 equals 5. He now has $5 left. But what if he started with nothing and then borrowed $5? 0 minus 5 equals? To the ancient Greeks, this equation was impossible. You can't subtract something from nothing. But in ancient China and India, mathematicians found a way around this. More than 2,000 years ago, Chinese merchants were already recording debt using different ink colors. Positive numbers were written in red. Negative numbers, debts, were written in black. If a merchant owed $5, he would write 5 in black ink. It was a simple, practical system. And just like that, negative numbers had quietly entered mathematics. But in Europe, it would take another 1,000 years before anyone took the idea seriously. In the 7th century, an Indian mathematician named Brahmagupta became the first person to officially define negative numbers. He laid out the basic rules for adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing negative numbers. His rules included a concept that still confuses students today. A negative times a negative is a positive. This was groundbreaking. For the first time, mathematics had consistent rules for working with negative numbers. But in Europe, most scholars still refused to accept them. By the 16th century, negative numbers had started appearing in European equations. But even then, mathematicians like Girolamo Cardano were hesitant. He called them fictitious numbers, numbers that worked on paper but made no sense in reality. Even in the 17th century, René Descartes called negative numbers false solutions to equations. But then, something changed. When Isaac Newton and Gottfried Leibniz developed calculus, negative numbers became unavoidable. Then when the Cartesian coordinate system was introduced, negative numbers finally made sense. They represented direction. Suddenly, negative numbers weren't fake anymore. They were useful, they were necessary, and they were here to stay. Today, negative numbers are everywhere. Temperature, it's -5 degrees outside. Bank accounts, my balance is -$50. Stock markets, the stock dropped by 10%. If negative numbers hadn't been accepted, modern finance, physics, engineering, even computer science wouldn't exist as we know it. For thousands of years, negative numbers were considered nonsense. They weren't real, they weren't useful, and they certainly weren't accepted by mathematicians. But today, we use them every single day. Negative numbers weren't just an addition to math, they were a revolution, an idea that transformed the way we understand the world.